My name is Sean O'Reilly. I'm the president-elect of the Notre Dame Alumni Association, and it's my distinct pleasure this morning to introduce Father Dan Groody. Father Dan Groody, Associate Professor of Theology and Global Affairs, is the Vice President and Associate Provost for Undergraduate Affairs. His major responsibilities include advancing undergraduate teaching, research, and outreach, as well as overseeing academic services for student-athletes, the Center for University Advising, the Flatley Center for Undergraduate Scholarly Engagement, the Moreau First Year Experience course, and the work of the Core Curriculum Committee. He also provides leadership for the student accommodations process and chairs the Advisory Committee on the Academic Code and Policy, the University Committee on the Honor Code, and the Valedictorian and Salutatorian Selection Committee. In addition to his role in the Provost's office, Father Groody serves as a fellow and trustee of the university and is the advisor for discernment and discovery for Notre Dame's Inspired Leadership Initiative. An internationally recognized expert on migration and refugee issues, whose papers and books have been translated into 7 languages, he is the author of Globalization, Spirituality, and Justice, Navigating the Path to Peace and Border of Death, Valley of Life, An Immigration Journey of Heart and Spirit. He has edited or co-edited 4 books on poverty, justice, and migration. Father Groody's expertise in and passion for refugee and migration issues has also been applied as executive producer of several acclaimed films and documentaries, including One Border, One Body, Immigration and the Eucharist, and Dying to Live, A Migrant's Journey. Father Groody has worked with the U.S. Congress, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the World Council of Churches, the Vatican, and the United Nations on issues of theology, globalization, migration, and refugees. In 2007 and 2008, he was a visiting research fellow at Oxford University's Refugee Studies Center. A member of the Notre Dame faculty since 2000, Father Groody is a faculty fellow of the university's Kellogg Institute, Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, Institute for Educational Initiatives, Klaus Center for Civil and Human Rights, Nanovic Institute for European Studies, and Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion. Father Groody earned his bachelor's degree from Notre Dame, a Master of Divinity degree, and a licentiate in sacred theology from the Jesuit School of Theology, and his doctorate in theology from the Graduate Theological Union. Would you please join me in welcoming Father Dan Groody?
Thank you, Sean, and it's great to be with you today. And some of you, I'm kind of in a time warp because some of you I remember from 40 years ago and I'm kind of re-meeting again. So it's coming back to this auditorium and to having you come back here after these many years. It's just great to have you back on campus. So I actually lived in Alumni Hall when I was a student.
No dogs.
No dogs. And the first 13 years when I was back here, I lived in Stanford, but then afterwards I moved over to Alumni. And Father George was still my rector. So I'm literally 7 doors down from where I was as a student. So it's kind of like being in an Alfred Hitchcock movie. So, well, there's a great energy having you back here, and it's wonderful to just open up the doors again and to just share some simple reflections today. And I've been asked to share something on leadership. And I guess over the years, we've been trying to ask, what is the essence of true leadership? And I'd like to look at it in many ways just beyond having a title or a position. What I'd really like to do is reflect on the inner authority of Jesus. And since we're in such a special place here, I thought it would be appropriate to just look at it in light of the building that we're in. And I've been really intrigued, lately about how the buildings here themselves reveal something of a spiritual architecture. And if you look just at the first kind of main buildings on campus, both the dome itself and the library, they really encapsulate so much of what's at the heart of the spirit of the university. That is Mary's yes to God, and through that, the word of life coming into our midst. So you can see in this library, as you step back at it, no doubt we're familiar with it, but you see stones coming from the 50 states, and you also see really all the searching of the prophets and of the sages, of the astronomers and of the scholars, searching for truth and understanding, but all of that coming into focus around Christ the teacher and the wisdom of the cross. So I would just like to offer just a few simple reflections today on Christ the teacher and on the wisdom of the cross. And in particular, the way Jesus taught. So commonly we think about Jesus really as the answer man. But really in many ways, he taught with authority. It was one of the things that people were attracted to about Jesus, that he didn't just kind of footnote and quote, the scholars of his time, but he actually had a truth from within him that attracted people. And I came across this statistic, more interesting last couple years, was that in the Gospels, Jesus is asked 187 questions in the Gospels. He's asked 187 questions. But interesting enough, he actually only answers 3 of them. And in return, he asks over 307 questions. That means for every question that Jesus answers, he asks 100 questions. And, for me, Notre Dame taught me how to ask questions. I think when I came here, it really helped me kind of ask what are the questions of life. And I often found those were unsettling questions. So I studied in PLS, and for every question that we were asked, we'd ask 10 more questions. So I was really consoled by the fact that Jesus really is more of the great questioner, really, rather than the answer man. And it's in these questions, I think, that as I've worked with students, and right now working at both sides of the equation, that is students who are just coming onto campus and who are going through their 4 years as undergraduates, but also students who are coming back to campus, people more our age, who've had an established career and they retire and they're still kind of searching and asking, what's the next step of my life? And where do I go from here? Or who am I now that I've raised a family or I've had a career? Ultimately, what is the meaning of my life? So these are the questions I think that we're all dealing with. And one of the great things about this space is that Notre Dame really encourages those questions. And I see Kristen Pacifico. I'm going to actually put her on the spot. But Kristen was part of a sort of a process early on when about, I don't know, what was it, 7 years ago or so, Kristen, that one of her classmates said, we've got these questions, and we know that we can default into a way of life or a career that can be lucrative, but we feel like there's something more that we want to ask. And they asked if I would work with someone from the business school to really pilot a class to really explore these questions. So we really did 4 things. We really wanted to know what are the questions that people are asking. Then we were saying, what are the themes related to those questions? Then what are the teaching practices that can help people get into those themes? And then what are the courses and programs that can help people get into that material? So we really, with Kristen, we started throwing spaghetti against the wall, and we just tried to see what worked, what didn't. Some things didn't. But we actually ended up started to explore life's big questions. There's a wonderful book by John Hagel and Fran Furter that named them this way. The first question is who am I? The identity question. And here when you come onto campus, it's interesting when the freshmen arrive because everyone's nervous. You don't dare say you're nervous because you don't want to reveal your vulnerability, but you really don't know who you are yet. And then you get in the dorm, and then suddenly you get a shirt. And then, if you're an alumni, you get a green shirt, and if you're in Dillon, you get a red shirt. So then you begin to realize that we're alumni, and they're Dillon. That means we're good, and they're bad. So then you go into the dorm, and then you have a section. We're in this section, we're in that section. And you have more regional identities. But then it shifts in that first football game. Suddenly, when that football game starts, and it's we are ND. They are Michigan or Ohio State. So this identity, these identity issues are inescapable, and I think they really stay with us throughout our lifetime. But what happens when those life experiences really shift, and then we suddenly find that we're inheriting a new identity? So I think looking at these questions of who am I are really part of the exploration. The second question is the intimacy question. Whom shall I be with? Does anybody know me? Does anybody care? It's really surprising now as we teach this course that's called The Heart's Desire and Social Change, people really still suffer from a feeling like nobody's there for me. COVID, I think, brought this out even more so. But trying to really ask, does anybody really attend to the questions that I have? Are they there for me in my difficult times? So all these questions, we can have all of the treasures in the world, but if we don't have anybody to share it with, then it's really not worth anything. So the intimacy question stays with us. If we're made by love, if we're made for love, and if we're made to love, it's a question that's always with us. The third is the life project question. What shall I do? What is the purpose of my life? How do I give back to it? These are ones also that shifts a lot over time. Fourthly is the significance question. What does it all mean? I can really spend a lot of time being busy during the day, but underneath it, what is it that drives it? And what is it that matters? And finally, the freedom question. How do I choose wisely in a way that's consistent with my true self? One of the ways we really look at it underneath, I'll say something about this in a moment, is also kind of whose story am I living? So often people are confined by a notion of success that don't allow them to really explore maybe the true life that they want to live. So how do I become liberated from that? And how do I become more authentic in really the journey that I'm on? So these are some of the questions that we're dealing with. I want to explore a little bit out of this as a context for understanding authentic leadership. But I just want to show just an overview video here that just offers somewhat of an overview of this theme.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
In 1969, the computer on Apollo 11 that took the astronauts to the moon had only 1 megahertz of computing power.
Eagle Houston, you're go for landing, over.
Today's iPhone has more than 100,000 times that power.
The Eagle has landed.
While we've made enormous progress in exploring the territory of outer space, we haven't really made comparable progress in the territory of inner space. And imagine where we would be today if we devoted that much time and energy to advancing our inner processing abilities. How can we find meaning in a restless world? How do we make wise decisions that help ourselves and others? How can we discover the deepest desires in our hearts and help make the world a better place? I'm Father Dan Groody, Vice President and Associate Provost at the University of Notre Dame. I'm starting a podcast to create meaningful conversations around these questions. This series, The Heart's Desire and Social Change, is based on a course I teach here at Notre Dame. And we'll explore the big questions that matter in life. How to find our purpose, values, and vocation. So join us today in this exciting adventure that explores the terrain of self-awareness, self-development, and self-gift for the good of others and ultimately for the needs of the world. Beginning April 15th, find us on your favorite podcast app and at our website, heartsdesiresocialchange.com. So that's not meant to be a commercial per se. Felt like that when I was watching it. But it's a way of saying that we've started exploring these questions, but we also realized, how can we open this conversation for more people to have them? And this is a part of what we've been trying to do and seeing, is there other ways that we can bring these to our alumni, to our clubs? Because what I find really impacts people when they come back to campus, say especially through the eyes of our Inspired Leadership Initiative, is to create a space to have meaningful conversations about things that matter. And I think that's part of what we can do at Notre Dame is really invite people to that deeper space and say there's more to our lives than just becoming successful in the narrow sense. I think what we're really hungry for is more to become fruitful, and that something of God's work within us really bears the fruit that endures. And so I just want to share with you just some additional reflections on this and sort of share our experience. It's just what we're learning here. It's not the last word by any means, but it's just ways in which we're finding some of those human chords that people are connecting with. But the guiding question for us is really, how do we connect our unique gifts? And I would add into this our weaknesses and our vulnerabilities. with the deepest desires within us, that is, and the needs and challenges of the world. And I think in this process, we're learning a lot. So I was asked to share just a little bit about this situation as well. For a couple of years, I was on this committee in the Vatican, and we would get together every 3 months, and we would look at some major issue, and we would bring people from different religions together around this. So I was one of the few Catholics actually on this group, even though it was in the Vatican. And I must say, we were kind of doing this kind of time after time, and I hadn't really looked too much in advance of what our project was that time. But when I got there, I was suddenly in a sea of people who were dressed in indigenous garb like this. And if you can imagine, like, you're right behind St. Peter's, you're right near the Vatican Museum, you're in this kind of room designed by Galileo, and all of a sudden you're with 40 people all dressed in this indigenous garb, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is a different meeting here. But this guy, when he spoke, his name is Chief Dominic Rankin. Of all the people that were at that meeting, I'm like, this guy has got a lot of depth. And so I went up to him an hour later and I said, I'd like to spend a little more time with you. And so he said, come with me in my canoe. So he invited me up to Canada, northern Canada, and we went up into the backcountry for like 10 days. And it was like being with Dr. Doolittle. And I mean, it was just the guy what I learned in that time of period was just amazing. And he knew that we were working on some leadership initiatives here. And so after we were done with this, he said, I want to bring you through a perspective of leadership from an indigenous angle. So he says, come back in a couple months and make a retreat. So a couple months later, I came back. It was snowing. We were at like 2 or 3 feet of snow in the Canadian wilderness. And I can remember being in this cabin. And he says, here's what we're going to do. He says, I want you to think about your 7 strongest qualities. And he says, then I want you to think about all your sins and mistakes. And he says, we're going to put each one of those in a leather bag. And then we're going to basically have a sweat lodge at the end of this and burn it. So I said, okay. So I was thinking about these things, and I said, well, I'm not actually thinking about qualities, but what I'm really going through my mind, because I'm more right brain minded, and I said, I want to know what these animals mean from an indigenous perspective. And what happened was these qualities began to come together around 7 animals. And these are the 7 animals that we discerned together. The first was the eagle, the sense of a being that connects with the heavens and looks at the big picture in the big frame. The second was the buffalo, and that it's to carry the heavy load. I remember when these animals were kind of coming into my radar, there was a buffalo that was a couple miles away, and I went out in the midst of the snow, like freezing cold, and watching a buffalo, and I'm like what gives? Like, why are we supposed to be connected? And that was just what came to me. It's like there's this big animal. It says, carry the heavy load. You don't have to show your strength unless provoked, but carry it. Thirdly, it's the beaver. He kept talking to me about the beaver and how the beaver labors on behalf of the community and the common good. And no matter whatever is thrown at him, he's resilient and he responds. Fourthly is the bear. I actually went there with bear issues. Those of you who are from California, I know some of you are out there. I had some bear issues when I was camping in Tuolumne Meadows, and I was kind of working them through. And I went there to work out my bear issues, and he killed a bear when he was 12. And we went through these. And so he looked at me like these big eyes, and he says, Daniel, he says, don't get in front of the bear. He says, let the bear get in front of you. So I'm like, okay, I think I know what that means, So Jesus is my alpha bear, so we'll go with that. A salmon, to be a priest today, swim upstream, go against the current. You really need to, and I think in our own lives, there's many applicabilities to this. Fourthly, the dolphin. One of the funnest times of my life was when I had a chance to swim with some dolphins in Jamaica. And, they kind of carried me around on their fins. They did one of those SeaWorld things where they popped me out of the water, and like I did all these fun things. And afterwards, they just had a few pieces of fish and they just went crazy. And I'm like, man, I just want to be a dolphin someday. This is really fun, And lastly, the dove. Whatever you do, bring peace. So it's interesting that, we discern these animals together, but then afterwards, throughout the day and throughout the week and the month, there'd be different moments when I'd be like dolphin, bear, dove, beaver, buffalo, eagle. Just different moments would call on different spaces. But to me, the wisdom that I learned from this man And I brought him to Notre Dame to talk to our students. He's also talked to our Inspired Leadership students. We go to the log chapel. We had a peace pipe ceremony there. I didn't bother asking for permission for this. I knew some of the people would have an issue with this. So, I decided not to do the peace pipe ceremony with the undergrads because I'm like, people are going to call me and say, are you smoking pot with their students now? It's like, just kind of was a little easy on that. But there was just a lot of wisdom there about leadership. I could go on and on about it. But what I really want to bring out is what he really helped me understand in deeper ways, how important it is to lead from within and to really have a sense of authentic leadership and to know what our strengths are and our weaknesses, what our gifts are and our failures, and to really have an ability to talk about that, to share about that with others. And so over time, what we developed was somewhat of a construct. When I talked with some of Kristen's classmates and others, I said, I found that this course was sort of almost meaning more over time, and that as time went on, these questions became more significant. So I asked them, what was it that spoke to you in this course? And they said, well, really, one is that it was really trying to help us look at three relationships. One is our relationship with ourselves. Secondly is our relationship with others. And thirdly, ultimately, it was our relationship with God. Now, interesting, one student kind of pointed this out to me. He says, when you actually are down here, there's a big distance between each other. But the closer that each one grows to God, the less distance there is to each other. And I think really, in my own work in migrants and refugees, there is a really, at heart, a vision of communion. And if really one of the reasons why Jesus came was to help to get the Humpty Dumpty of the human race back together again, the long journey of life is a journey towards communion and how we deal with our brokenness and our fragmentedness and how we really move towards communion. So we really were kind of focusing on these questions. We really wanted to ask, who are we, where are we, and why are we? But also we were building this around sort of very personal questions. Who am I? Why am I? And where am I? So these questions ultimately opened up to an exploration of what's the true self all about. When I divest from all of my expectations of what I think I should be, who's the person that I want to be? And this ends up being a very important part of it is, whose story am I actually living? And is the story that I'm living really aligned with my inner life? Is there a flow between my inner life and my outer world? That's ultimately where we're trying to find a flow on that. So this is part of the exploration. And I say to the students from the beginning, I say in some ways this is going to be one of the easiest courses that you ever take, because I'm not going to ask you to really just parrot back to me or repeat back to me what you've learned. But I said if you really do this work, and it's up to you to really do it, and you have to really decide how much you want to invest in it, if you really do it, it's going to be one of the hardest courses you ever take. And in the course evaluations year after year, people will say this was really one of the most demanding courses that I've ever had to go through, because this is hard work. This is really hard work to do that inner discovery, and we have to stop the busyness train in order to go into that inner space, which is something we're almost more reluctant to do. We didn't have computers when many of us were here as students, or they were just coming online when we were here. We probably had one phone that was at kind of the middle of the hallway. Things have changed a lot on campus. And while some things have stepped forward, I think this ability to reflect and to listen to the inner space really has changed a lot. And I wonder whether it also contributes to the mental health issues that we're constantly facing as well. If we just don't take any time to listen to these issues, if we don't deal with these issues, then in some level these issues are going to deal with us. So all of this is really talking about personal transformation. How do I become all that I'm really called to be? How do we look at spiritual transformation? But in the end, it's also not just a self-actualization process. How do we actually look at what it means for other people as well in social transformation? So this is just a way of talking about growing in self-awareness, growing in self-development, but also growing in self-gift. So the goal here is not self-fulfillment. I think so much of the culture is predicated on just fulfilling my needs. But this side of eternity, there's no complete fulfillment. I think we have to actually integrate within our awareness some emptiness, brokenness, unfulfillment that's inevitable. But there's some fulfillment that can come, I think, as a byproduct of giving ourselves away paradoxically. So the fruit of that is really authenticity. How do we become more genuine? How do I actually let the different pieces of my life come together? But also in that, how do I have a deeper sense, a clearer sense of what I'm uniquely called to do in this world while I'm alive? So this is more of a construct and a framework of human development. But these are some of the themes as well, like how do we get into this? What are some of the pathways to this? One, we say, let's stop the busyness train. Let's actually just listen to what's happening within. Let's try to pay attention to what feelings are there and to really see in what ways can they reveal something important. So slowing people down, really taking time to listen, and then trying to tune in. You may remember those radio dials that we used to have when we were growing up, when you'd have that radio station, you'd continue to dial across, and then you'd find a station, and then you turn it again until you find the music you want, and then you hopefully find the song you want, all of that. So you're kind of like tuning in to that and saying, okay, that actually is something I need to hear. But there's a lot of static going on too. Or maybe for those of you who are part of another generation, it's like Pandora. You go thumbs up, thumbs down. Like I want more of that and I want less of that. But tuning into our inner lives is a lot like that. And how do we literally tune in to our hearts so that we can listen to it and respond? We spend time looking at personal values and culture, both how they're what's important to us or what we've imbibed from our families, and really how these cultures interact. This is one of the major problems of our times, really, is how we deal with difference and how we deal with otherness, but also how we are rooted, again, in the authority of our own convictions of what matters, but how we bring that into dialogue with others. The true self and the false self that I mentioned, and Richard Rohr is, I think, so articulate on this one, but it's not that the false self is the bad self, it's just not the real self. And I know when I came to Notre Dame, I actually, when I was a kid, I knew what I wanted to do when I saw the 1976 Olympics and I watched Franz Klammer win the downhill. And I was like, man, that's what I want to be someday, is a downhill skier, and someday to be in the Olympics and someday win a gold medal. And then as time went on, I realized, no, actually that childhood dream kind of evolved into something else, which was ultimately to study under the Golden Dome. But then I realized while I was under the Golden Dome, what really matters, what endures, is a golden heart. So I think Neil Young probably had it right, is that searching for a heart of gold is ultimately searching for the heart of God, I think, is at the core of life. And to me, those were themes that became very important. But I never lost a sense of that skier within. So it's, again, not that this was a bad thing, but it just wasn't enough. And how do we go deeper over time, even with those childhood things that are part of us? That's part of what we help people work through. This is one of the areas, I think, where people go off the rails. At some point, we can't go deeper into the heart's desire unless we also think about where we need to be forgiven and who we need to forgive. This is often the hardest part of the course, because this means getting in touch with some very painful memories on this. But it's also the beginning of a process of healing and of releasing a lot of stuff that bogs us down and keeps us from going into this space. We have this exercise in gratitude as well, where I credit John Groody, who teaches with me on this, and we actually have them write a letter to somebody who they're really grateful for, whether they're alive or they've passed away. But if they are alive, at the end of the class, we have these integration exercises, and they actually have to then call the person and read that letter to them. You'd be amazed how a simple exercise like that really changes people. We had one member of our Inspired Leadership Initiative this year who called the judge that he had worked for, and he says, I want to thank you for the impact you've had on my life. And the judge says, actually, no, you're the one who impacted me, and I want to tell you the difference that you made in my life. And he ended up dying 2 weeks later. Little did I know that this same guy, his parents taught my mother, and the judge was also the lawyer who helped my my grandfather, who had black lung disease as a coal miner. So you never quite know how these parts of connections are going to come together. But this is really an important path. Discernment, decision making. We talked a little bit with some of you beforehand about how do we sort out, not just discernment can be seen as just like good decisions or bad decisions, but really how do we get to the ones that are aligned most deeply with our journey with God and really what God's calling us to do. So we draw heavily on Ignatian discoveries here and Ignatian discernment. Lots of stuff I'd like to get into here, but I just want to sort of present the broad outlines. We look at loneliness and intimacy, different elements of that. And then at the end, what we do in the course, we walk through the cemetery and we look at the difference between what David Brooks refers to as resume virtues versus eulogy virtues. So I ask students to really walk through the cemetery, to really look at the tombstones, to get in touch with their own experiences of death, and then to ask what would they put on their tombstone. And then they have to go home and write their own obituary. And then after that, in the context of that, we actually have Mass. And we see that the journey of the Eucharist in ritual form is really a microcosm of our journey through life, ultimately that lead to our journey to the altar and to the meeting of God. So how do we actually, as John Donne used to even put it, how does our own coming to terms with death help us live life? And I think it can shift you, even if it's just 1 degree. Interestingly enough, in the journey to the moon, at one point in the initial Apollo mission, as they were aiming for the moon, they were off by 1 degree. And you think about it, 1 degree doesn't seem like a terribly long, a big amount. But actually, when you think about it, if they actually were off by that 1 degree, they would have missed the moon. So 1 degree of difference can make a huge impact. And I think this is part of what we want to do, is just not even think about how we're going to change everything, but how we even change ourselves. You know, when I remember there was a saying once, my uncle said this to me. He says, when I was young, he says, I wanted to save the world. He says, when I was ordained, I wanted to save the church. He says, now that I'm older, I just want to save myself. He says, all the rest is gravy. So, in any event, we have different integration exercises here which try to put into practice some of these themes, so it's not just head knowledge, but it's actually transformational knowledge. We have different kind of also fears. One of the more interesting processes is we actually have people come to terms with their fears in ways that we ask them write down their 10 biggest fears, and then out of that they have to prioritize the 3 biggest of those 10, and then from that they have to sort of come up and then put those in 1 or 2 words. And then when you have them do this together in a group, and it takes a good part of the semester to get to this point, you realize how much these personal fears are very universal. But how many people are afraid of being alone, being rejected, of not being enough, of disappointing others, of being a failure. And so when you have a space to talk about some of those, it makes a difference. But then you do that also in the context of a faith vision. And so afterwards, when they're all done, and I said, what would it be like to share some of this with at least one person? It breaks down the loneliness, the isolation. But then I usually do it when it's right below, when there's a cross right above the blackboard. And I said, at this point, I want you to theologize. What's the connection between what's on the board versus what's above it? And then you begin to make the connections to say that Jesus embodies our deepest fears, and that it's in trusting him who overcome all that threatens us, death in its most sort of diverse forms, it really kind of articulates a vision of hope and also a vision of faith. So all of this is, I think, a way of speaking about how we really grow into a space of becoming more authentic and living from an inner authority to just be ourselves, whether others accept that or not, but to living from that. And I think we're just trying to explore different ways of bringing this to people. You may have some ideas yourself. So this is a work in progress. We continue to learn, we continue to listen to what's people are responding to. But I just offered some of these ideas just as a way of understanding leadership and a way of being guided from within and being guided by the Spirit. And if we have a minute or two, maybe we can open it up to some questions. I'll wait to you to tell me when we're cut up. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question, but I want to share that I saw a beaver this morning. So I was really talking about when you said that.
Awesome. That's great. Actually, go meet him. Where did you see him?
On my walk over here.
Oh.
Behind the river, behind the little lake.
I didn't know they were on campus.
I've been doing 12-step recovery for 20 years, and a lot of the things that you're dealing with are very similar to that: trust touch, help others, clean house, and it's all about getting out of yourself and looking at the big picture. So it was a great reflection this morning for me.
Yeah, these are universal themes, and these are kind of just another way of approaching, I think, there are other spaces out there where people are trying to enter this deeper space and become more free.
So I teach moral theology and really emphasize asking questions. So I appreciated what you said about Christ as teacher as a great questioner. My question is so what? We've identified Christ as this questioner. What do we do with that? Or what does that mean for us?
Yeah. I think one is reflection. I mean, I think the starting is when Jesus, says, what do you think of this story? Man had two sons. Well, I mean, Jesus, had his own opinion. If you lose 100, if you have 100 sheep and you lose one of them, what is your opinion? I think on this one, he's really saying, let's hold up a mirror and let's really look at who we are as a person. And let's look at the kind of choices that we're making and the kind of person we're becoming. So I don't think it's more like a speculative question. It's a formational question. And it's not just information, it's formation and it's transformation. So I think we ask these questions for the sake of becoming transformed more into God's image and likeness. That would be my own take on it. And that's to me where the work is. But reflection is in short supply, these days. I think, again, we're just so active, we're so busy. In the process, we're really running ourselves into the ground and we're losing ourselves in the process. Yes?
I've seen the word of life mural up there so many times, but I never thought about it until now, where you pointed out that, you see all these images of not only spiritual people, but astronomers and different scientists trying to find out what the truth is. But when you look at the Word of God, John 14:6 says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so, in my discovery, what I've found is that by searching the Word of God has helped me to not only climb the ladder toward God, but also to be a better servant to others horizontally. And that, when you get into the Word of God, you find that it's a living Word. I read the same thing today that I read 15 years ago, and it's totally a new perspective that I had then. So I'm the one that is benefiting by the growth. But when you pointed out, in life today, it seems to be so relativistic in the sense that everyone has an opinion. And it's very difficult. I think our struggle a lot of times is to be diverse and to be opinionated and to respect others' opinions and all the values of that. I'm not diminishing that. But there has to be an absolute at some point. And when I look at the Word of life, you've given me the answer. Because Jesus, if you notice, Jesus is at the top. And I just thought about John 14:6. I am the truth.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
I'm so happy to see that you talked to them about their eulogy and had them walk in the cemetery. I taught religious ed, and I did that with my 7th graders, which was probably very ambitious. Nonetheless, some of them had something as simple as, I want to be a great baseball player. And I encouraged them to use that as a way of changing their behavior, to just go out and change their behavior and go practice, for instance. But I'm wondering, Father, how you would have us use that as leaders in our clubs and perhaps in our affinity groups, and how would you encourage us to use that as an exercise without being overbearing, perhaps in our theological and spiritual encouragement for our constituency?
Well, Dolly, I throw that back to you. I mean, so I guess I would say if there's a hunger for these issues, let us know and maybe we can work on something.
I think it's a very powerful exercise.
Yeah, and just see what works. I'm going to defer to those who are in charge here because I know you're actually waiting for the people. But yeah.
Can you please give Father